How did a non-profit lab become one of the most influential companies in the world? Why did OpenAI quickly move away from its original model, take billions from Microsoft, and begin talking about hundreds of billions for compute? Who held the company together in November 2023 when the board removed Sam Altman? How did OpenAI go from research lab to GPT, ChatGPT, GPT-4o, reasoning models, Sora, and agentic products? And why is a company that promises to build AGI for the benefit of humanity now living simultaneously in hypergrowth, lawsuits, and disputes over its own mission? By March 2026, OpenAI itself reported $122 billion in new funding at an $852 billion post-money valuation, more than 900 million weekly ChatGPT users, and more than $2 billion in monthly revenue. OpenAI was announced on December 11, 2015. In the official text, OpenAI named Sam Altman and Elon Musk as co-chairs, Ilya Sutskever as research director, and Greg Brockman as CTO. The founding members including Andrei Karpathy, John Schulman, Wojciech Zaremba, Dark Kingma, Trevor Blackwell, Vicky Chung, and Pamela Vegata. At launch, the founders committed $1 billion. OpenAI listed Sam Altman, Elon Musk, Greg Brockman, Reid Hoffman, Jessica Livingstone, Peter Thiel, AWS, Infosys, and YC Research among them. This was not an ordinary startup with a seed round and a single CEO. From day one, it was a project selling not a product, but a grand idea: to build AGI in such a way that not just one legal entity, but humanity would benefit. In its first announcement, OpenAI wrote, "OpenAI is a non-profit artificial intelligence research company and promised to develop digital intelligence so that it would benefit humanity as a whole." Later, this logic was fixed in the charter and in the 2019 documents in an even stricter formula. Our primary fiduciary obligation is to advance the aims of the OpenAI charter. That phrase would later become central in disputes over whether the company violated its own mission when it moved ever deeper into a commercial model. In its early years, OpenAI was above all a research laboratory. It publishes papers, built tools, worked on reinforcement learning, robotics, and language models. In May 2025, OpenAI itself looked back on that period this way: "We began in 2015 as a research lab. We had no products, no business, and no commercial revenue. At that time, the company still did not understand that the main constraint would turn out to be not only the talent of researchers, but the volume of computation." In its early years, OpenAI thought more like a research institute than like a giant computational infrastructure. The first major technical turning points came through language models. In 2019, OpenAI released GPT-2 and described it as a 1.5 billion parameter model. The release was staged because of concerns about misuse. In 2020, GPT-3 arrived with 175 billion parameters. That was the moment the market saw that scaling large language models produced not merely incremental improvement, but a qualitative leap. For OpenAI, this was the first major answer to the question posed at the beginning of the story. How did a lab become the center of the AI boom? It learned to turn compute into capability faster than most. By 2019, OpenAI had already publicly acknowledged that philanthropists' money and its previous structure would not be enough. In its post announcing OpenAI LP, the company wrote directly that it would need billions of dollars for large-scale cloud compute, recruiting talent, and AI supercomputers. That is how the capped profit model appeared. OpenAI LP as a hybrid of non-profit and for-profit, where control remained with OpenAI non-profit, while investors and employees received capped returns. For early investors, the cap was 100x. Inside OpenAI itself, this was presented as a compromise between the mission and the need to raise capital at a scale that an ordinary non-profit structure simply could not withstand. A few years later, OpenAI would describe this turn even more bluntly. In 2025, it wrote that it had originally underestimated the role of supercomputer clusters and the sheer scale of compute, and that it later became clear that the mission could not be sustained without far more capital. In the same letter, Sam Altman would frame it almost as a confession. OpenAI is not a normal company and never will be. That is the main answer to why OpenAI moved so quickly away from simple non-profit logic. Frontier AI turned out to be too expensive for the old structure. In July 2019, Microsoft invested $1 billion in OpenAI and became its cloud partner. OpenAI wrote that it wanted to license some pre-AGI technologies, while Microsoft would be the preferred partner for commercializing them. This was one of the decisive turning points in the company's entire history. OpenAI gained access to capital and infrastructure, while Microsoft gained access to one of the world's strongest frontier AI teams. Later, the scale of the relationship only intensified. In 2024, Reuters wrote that the Microsoft-OpenAI partnership had come under antitrust scrutiny in the US and Europe, and in July 2024, Microsoft gave up its board observer seat amid regulatory scrutiny. But something else mattered even more. The alliance with Microsoft gave OpenAI what it had previously lacked in sufficient quantity: stable access to compute. In March 2023, OpenAI was already writing that together with Azure, it had co-designed a supercomputer from the ground up for its workload. And in March 2026, the company described compute as the strategic advantage that compounds across the entire system. In other words, the answer to how OpenAI grew so quickly lies not only in algorithms. It lies in the combination of model, product, distribution, and a massive volume of infrastructure. Before the mass consumer explosion, OpenAI had already assembled a whole lineup of key technologies. In January 2021, the company introduced DALL, a 12 billion parameter model that generates images from text prompts. In January 2022, it published its work on InstructGPT and wrote directly that the new models had become much better at following user intentions than GPT-3, and at the same time, more truthful and less toxic. In September 2022, Whisper appeared, an ASR system trained on 680,000 hours of multilingual and multitask supervised data. This was no longer a single language product, but a platform of directions: text, speech, images, alignment. InstructGPT is especially important for the entire later story. Before it, large language models could generate text, but they did not always follow the user's intent well. After RLHF and fine-tuning and human feedback, OpenAI obtained a model that fit much better in the format of a mass-market interface. This was the technical bridge between a research LLM and the product that would later become ChatGPT. Without that transition, OpenAI might have remained a strong lab. With it, it became a candidate for a mass consumer product. On November 30, 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT as a research preview. The announcement said, "We've trained a model called ChatGPT which interacts in a conversational way." At the same time, it looked like just another product release within a research line. In practice, ChatGPT became the thing that changed not only OpenAI, but the entire market. According to research by OpenAI and Harvard, by July 2025, ChatGPT was being used by 700 million people a week, sending 18 billion messages per week, about 10% of the world's adult population. OpenAI explicitly wrote that such speed of global adoption has no precedent. From there, growth only accelerated. In November 2025, OpenAI reported more than 1 million business customers, more than 7 million ChatGPT for Work seats, and more than 800 million weekly users. And in March 2026, it was already talking about more than 900 million weekly active users, more than 50 million subscribers, and $2 billion in monthly revenue. In other words, the answer to how the company so quickly became the center of the AI boom is simple. It did not merely train a powerful model. It was the first to package it into a consumer interface that became a habit for hundreds of millions of people. After ChatGPT, OpenAI began building not just one breakout product, but an entire product line. In March 2023, GPT-4 was released. OpenAI described it as a large multimodal model and gave one of its most headline-grabbing examples. On a simulated bar exam, GPT-4 performed around the top 10% of test takers, whereas GPT 3.5 was around the bottom 10%. In fall 2023 at Dev Day, the company introduced GPT-4 Turbo with a 128K context window. The Assistant's API, Vision, the DALL 3 API, and other developer tools. This was already the language of a platform, not of a single chatbot. In May 2024, OpenAI unveiled GPT-4o, a new flagship model for real-time work with text, audio, and images. The company wrote that the model could respond to audio in an average of 320 milliseconds, and sometimes as fast as 232 milliseconds, roughly at the level of human reaction time. Then OpenAI spun reasoning models into a distinct line and described them this way. They spend more time thinking before they respond. In parallel, the company launched Sora for text-to-video and moved ever more strongly toward agentic products. The answer to how OpenAI made the journey from laboratory to platform lies precisely here. Each new stage expanded not only capability, but also the number of user-facing models. On November 17, 2023, OpenAI's board of directors fired Sam Altman. Within hours, Miro Murati became interim CEO. Greg Brockman left the company, and then came the days that nearly destroyed OpenAI. Reuters reported that more than 700 employees threatened to quit and join Altman at Microsoft if the board did not resign and bring him back. That was the moment when the question from the beginning of the text, who held the company together in its hardest days, received a very concrete answer. Miro Murati as transitional leader, Greg Brockman as Altman's ally, Microsoft as the emergency exit, and the employees themselves, who literally showed the board that they were ready to carry OpenAI's human core out with them. The ending came quickly. On November 22, Reuters reported that Altman was returning as CEO and that OpenAI was changing the composition of its board. On November 29, OpenAI itself published a post in which Altman wrote, "I am returning to OpenAI as CEO," later adding, "I have never been more excited about the future." Brett Taylor became chair of the new initial board, joined by Larry Summers and Adam D'Angelo. For the company, this was a moment of survival. OpenAI preserved its product, team, and violation only because the internal coup failed to win support from the people who actually built the company. In March 2024, a special board committee announced the results of the review conducted by WilmerHale. The lawyers conducted dozens of interviews, reviewed more than 30,000 documents, and in the end the board stated, "We have unanimously concluded that Sam and Greg are the right leaders for OpenAI." But that was not the most important part. WilmerHale concluded that the crisis had not been caused by product safety problems, not by finances, not by the pace of development, and not by its statements to investors. The cause was a breakdown in trust between the previous board and Altman. This is a crucial fork in OpenAI's whole story. The company's loudest crisis turned out not to be the consequence of one dangerous breakthrough or one model, but a crisis of governance. In other words, the internal coup nearly destroyed the company not because it was moving too quickly toward AGI, but because its unusual structure gave the board enormous power, while the management architecture itself was insufficiently stable. After that, OpenAI strengthened the board, introduced new governance rules, and a whistleblower hotline, but the issue of how the company is structured had already ceased to be a philosophical question and become a legal and corporate one. After Altman's return, OpenAI did not fall apart, but the narrow circle of people who had built it from the beginning or during its key years began to thin out. In May 2024, co-founder and chief scientist Ilya Sutskever left. In August 2024, co-founder John Schulman departed. Greg Brockman took a sabbatical. In September 2024, Reuters reported the departure of Miro Murati, along with two other senior research executives. For OpenAI, this was a painful blow. Murati was not only CTO, but also one of the company's main public faces, and in the hardest days of November 2023, it was she who assumed interim leadership. These departures matter not as gossip, but for a deeper reason. For years, OpenAI had rested on a small group of figures: Altman, Brockman, Sutskever, Murati, Schulman, Zaremba, and several key researchers and product leaders. After 2023, that configuration began to change. And this too answers the question of who stood by the company in its hardest moments. Many of those who held it together then later either left or stepped back from their former roles. In 2025, OpenAI returned again to the question of its own structure. The company wrote directly that it had once estimated its capital needs at about $10 billion, but the reality of frontier AI demanded much larger sums. In May 2025, the board announced an updated plan. The nonprofit would retain control, while the operating business would transition into a public benefit corporation. The statement said that this decision had been made after dialogue with the offices of the Attorney General of Delaware and the Attorney General of California. In other words, OpenAI's structure was already being discussed not only within the company, but with the state. It was in this context that Altman wrote to employees, "OpenAI is not a normal company and never will be." In the same letter, he recalled the early years this way: "We started out starting at each other around a kitchen table. It is a powerful formula for the whole OpenAI story. A company that began as an almost kitchen table research project had, by 2025-2026, moved on from arguing about which paper to publish to arguing about how to reconcile mission, nonprofit control, equity, investors, regulators, and the tens of billions required for compute." One of OpenAI's heaviest legal fronts is copyright. The New York Times sued OpenAI and Microsoft in 2023, accusing them of using millions of articles without permission to train models. In April 2025, as Reuters reported, several major copyright cases against OpenAI and Microsoft were consolidated in Manhattan. Then, in October 2025, the court refused to dismiss authors' claims that ChatGPT outputs could infringe copyrights. And in December 2025, OpenAI lost a secrecy dispute and was ordered to turn over 20 million anonymized ChatGPT chat logs. For the company, this is no longer a peripheral dispute, but a major multi-year procedural front. These cases also matter because they strike directly at the foundation of generative AI, where the training data came from and what counts as permissible use of protected content. OpenAI defends itself through fair use and argues that its practices are lawful and necessary for innovation. The plaintiffs, by contrast, are trying to prove that behind the explosion of model capabilities lies not some abstract internet, but specific intellectual labor belonging to others. There is still no final judicial answer on the merits, but the sheer weight of these cases already shows why OpenAI increasingly lives not only in releases, but in court. Elon Musk, one of the OpenAI's co-founders, became one of its harshest opponents in 2024-2026. His lawsuit is built around a simple claim: OpenAI violated its founding mission when it shifted in a commercial direction and tied itself to Microsoft. Reuters reported that in January 2026, a judge allowed part of the case to proceed to a jury trial. Earlier, the agency had written that Musk and OpenAI had agreed to a fast-track trial over the for-profit shift. Musk himself is seeking enormous sums. In January 2026, Reuters wrote of a claim of up to $134 billion against OpenAI and Microsoft. OpenAI responds that the lawsuit is baseless, and the company has published materials arguing that Musk himself had earlier supported the idea of a more commercial and scalable structure. But for the story, something else matters more. This lawsuit answers the question posed at the beginning of the text. Why does OpenAI increasingly find itself not only at the center of hype, but also in legal conflicts? Because the dispute is no longer about model quality, but about who gets to define what it means to benefit humanity inside a business worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Beyond the courts, regulatory processes are also closing in around OpenAI. In July 2023, the FTC opened an investigation into OpenAI over claims that the company may have put personal reputations and data at risk. In January and June 2024, Reuters reported on the allocation of antitrust oversight between the DOJ and the FTC on issues involving OpenAI, Microsoft, and other AI giants. And in April 2026, Reuters wrote that the European Commission was assessing whether ChatGPT falls under the stricter DSA regime. The trigger was OpenAI's disclosure that the service had averaged 120.4 million monthly active users in the EU over the 6-month period through September 2025, far above the 45 million threshold. And here we can now answer the questions from the beginning directly. How did a non-profit lab become the center of the AI boom? Through scaling, more compute, stronger models, a better product, broader distribution. Why did OpenAI have to break its own structure? Because the nations and the beautiful mission did not cover the cost of frontier AI. Who held the company together in its hardest days? Reddy, Brockman, the employees who threatened a mass departure, and Microsoft, which became the fallback airfield. How did the company travel from lab to platform? Through GPT, InstructGPT, DALL, Whisper, ChatGPT, GPT-4, GPT-4o, Reasoning, Sora, and the enterprise product line. And why does it now live amid lawsuits and investigations? Because OpenAI is no longer just a research organization. It is one of the central infrastructures of the AI era, and such companies inevitably end up arguing not only about technology, but about power, money, data, law, and their own right to define the future.